Hi, my name is Mushfiq Mobarak, and I'm a development economist at Yale University. So in development, we often worry about and work on how to get people to change their behaviors, to adopt new products, new technologies, new behaviors that we think are good for them. And during this pandemic, a couple of these really important examples arrive. So one is, how do we get people to wear masks? That's an important behavior change question. And then the second one that I'm now really focused on is, how do we get people vaccinated, especially in remote rural areas of low and middle income countries. So before jumping into vaccines, I'll spend just a couple of minutes telling you about what we learned about masks, because in a lot of ways, the vaccine studies are an extension of what we did with masks. So to understand this question about masks, we conducted a very large-scale randomized control trial in rural Bangladesh. And we designed the trial to answer two different questions. So one is what I call the first stage question, is how do we get people to wear masks? And if we are successful in getting them to wear masks, then what is the effect on COVID-19 transmission, right? And it was a cluster randomized control trial. We collected data on about 340,000 adults who were the subject of the treatment. And it's clustered because an entire village plus the mosque that serves the village, the market that serves the village, that was the unit of intervention. And then the control areas were physically distant from that entire community. And we also tested different types of masks. So given the very large sample, that allowed us to do, rather than a 2-arm trial, something like a 16-20-arm trial, where we tested a portfolio of various different types of encouragement strategies to see what works to get people to wear masks consistently. And so I'll just jump, rather than giving you the full details, I'll just jump to the bottom line as to what works. Okay. Which is, if you do 4 things in combination, that led to persistent increases in mask usage. Okay. And those 4 things were no-cost mask distribution. So we went door to door to every household in the village and distributed masks for free. And when we distributed masks, we offered information about the importance of wearing masks. And in this case, the prime minister of the country, the captain of the cricket team in Bangladesh, a religious leader, they all recorded little videos for us, endorsing the concept and encouraging people to wear masks. And then we also had to do secondary distribution at mosques, because that's a place where people come together and stand shoulder to shoulder at very high density. And so we had to therefore work with the imam of the mosque and get him to endorse the concept and explain to his congregants why this was important. And we distributed masks at the entrance to the mosque, because people from other communities might have been coming in there as well. And then finally, we learned, after doing all these 3 things through iterative experimentation, that this works to increase mask usage, but it was only about a 10-12 percentage point effect. So we then added a 4th component, which turned out to triple our effect size. And that is that you can't just go and distribute masks on day 1 and then leave. You have to periodically revisit the village and do some reinforcement, which is, we hired mask promoters, generally locally from the community itself. And their job was to sort of politely intercept people who are walking around not wearing masks and say that, look, we distributed masks to every single household, so we know you received one. Why don't you put yours on? Or if you forgot it, can you go back and get it? Or if that was inconvenient, here's a replacement mask that we have. And could you please put it on, but don't forget it next time, because we don't have too many of these. So that interception, a tiny bit of social framing, that seemed to have really had a large effect on people's behavior, in that they wanted to avoid that sort of awkward conversation, and that led to over a 30 percentage point increase in mask wearing. And so what is that effect size? So not only, in the control villages, we see about 12% of people wearing masks properly covering nose and mouth. And in the treatment villages, this jumps to about 45%. And more importantly, that effect stayed persistent. So not only during the period of the intervention, but we tracked for 10 weeks. And even 10 weeks after the first day of mask distribution, we see that in the treatment villages, mask wearing rate stayed higher than control. Okay, so that's what we learned about mask usage. And then once we see this increase in mask usage of about 30 percentage points, that led to about an 11% reduction in COVID symptoms. And it also led to a reduction, statistically significant, about 10% reduction in COVID seropositivity, so symptomatic COVID. Okay. All right, and then we've other than publishing the work in a scientific journal, we also have been trying to get the word out through a variety of media outlets across many different countries, including in the countries where we've been working: Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, India, etc. And since then, the other part of this is not only to do the research, but to think about scaling. So as soon as the results came out, even before the publication came out, we started working intensely with governments and large NGOs in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Nepal to distribute masks. So to date, we've been able to distribute over 110 million masks, thanks to Hanes Brands. They made a large donation. We've sent those masks by ship to Bangladesh and Pakistan, and say BRAC in Bangladesh covered 80 million people, about half the country. And that was done in conjunction with and government permission that the government gave us a responsibility to run that norm model, the model that I described here, run that model for about half the country where the COVID prevalence rate was higher. Okay, so then, beyond just talking to, say, CDC, WHO, et cetera, our attention then turned to the question that's of relevance now, which is beyond masks, right? How do we get vaccines, people to take vaccines? And so we're running randomized controlled trials now in Sierra Leone, India, and Pakistan to promote vaccinations, and taking a similar approach, which is the approach being a cluster randomized controlled trial, or actually individual level randomized controlled trials. Yeah. Okay, so now when you ask the question, why are vaccination rates lagging in low and middle income countries, right? There are three categories of explanations that people have been discussing. So one is that, so for example, many in Africa have claimed rightly that, look, we're effectively withholding vaccines from poor countries, and that rich countries are giving boosters at a rate that's greater than first doses being given to poor Africans, right? So there is an international supply chain failure. Okay, so that's one category of explanation. A second one that, say, the CEO of Pfizer has been on record as saying is that, oh, you know what, actually vaccine hesitancy is very high. So if you were to send vaccines to, say, the continent of Africa, there's a lot of hesitancy, and so the vaccinations go unused and they expire, and that's a waste, right? So to try and, before doing any trials, to try and get a sense of this particular question, right, we actually went around collecting systematic vaccine hesitancy and acceptance data across a number of low and middle income countries, and then also included United States as Russia as sort of benchmarks, right? And what we find in this paper published in Nature Medicine, we find that in every single low middle income country sample, vaccination hesitancy is actually lower than it is in the United States, and much, much lower than it is in Russia, right? So this claim that hesitancy is high is just not true according to the data. So as opposed to hesitancy, there is a problem that ends up looking like hesitancy that low middle income countries do need to invest in and work on. And that is the problem of access. So in Sierra Leone, where we started collecting data, which will be one of the sites of the interventions that we're running, it takes on average 3 hours in the rural areas where we're working each way for people to get to the nearest vaccination center. So overall, 6 hours, it's like an overnight trip, right? And it costs $6.50 for the trip in a country in a region where the majority of people live on less than $1.50 a day. So the issue is that people are not, while they're willing to take vaccines, they're not that eager such that they will spend that much in cost in order to get access to a vaccine. And that ends up looking like hesitancy. You put the vaccines in the vaccination centers, people aren't showing up because it's too costly to show up, right? So that's the issue that we need to address, that we're trying to now design a trial and actually piloting that trial now to address. And our idea there is, rather than having a distribution system that's very difficult because of the difficulties in infrastructure, right? To solve that problem by sending vaccines on the back of a motorbike in a cooler, along with a nurse, to the communities in order who can administer those vaccines, right? So that's going to be our primary idea or innovation to try and address the access difficulties, right? But beyond that, it's also possible that we need to do some community mobilization in advance, right? Which is the picture that you see in the middle. And that community mobilization will serve to prepare the community for vaccine arrival, make sure that the leaders understand and endorse this idea of vaccines coming in. And hopefully that means that people will show up at the prescribed day and time very efficiently, such that we can cost effectively administer large numbers of vaccines quickly in that community. Right? So we are, through this trial, we're asking first the question of, is providing enhanced access sufficient to get a lot more people vaccinated? And then second, is some additional community mobilization activities important as a complement to get more people vaccinated more cost effectively, such that the cost per jab goes down, even though mobilization itself is expensive. And so the trial design will have 3 arms. So there's going to be a control group where it's just status quo, and we provide general information about where the nearest vaccination center is, where people can go. In the second group of villages, we enhance access by doing this last mile delivery on a motorbike, sending a nurse and a cooler. Right? And then in a third arm, we're doing something that costs a bit more money, which is adding some mobilization. So of course, even in village set 2, there will be some mobilization activities. You can't just show up as a surprise. You will have to do some preparation work. But here we're doing some enhanced mobilization work where we're actually going door to door, doing some knocking and trying to encourage people to show up at the prescribed day and time. And the reason to have both of these arms is because you want to know whether or not cost per jab is minimized in village set 2 or village set 3. Yeah. So I am actually in Sierra Leone at the moment, working on piloting these strategies, and so hopefully in the Q&A I'll have more to report to you on what we are finding. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to our interactions.